when the Marquess claims a governess. Prologue. The carriage rattled down the road, rocking uneasily from side to side. Edward didn't mind the rain or the thunder because today it was just himself and Mother. When it was just him and Mother, he could speak freely for once. He could tell her about the books he was reading without being ridiculed by Robert, his twin, or talked down to by Father, who continued to be frustrated by his squeamishness towards hunting. Ever since the baby's arrival, it had been challenging to claim Mother's attention. Edward loved his new sister, but he also missed the ease of being able to converse with Mother whenever he saw fit. Yet despite Edward's joy at having her to himself, today Mother looked nervous. She kept fidgeting with the edge of her dress and asking Edward to repeat himself, even though they were discussing Robinson Crusoe, a mutual favourite. "What is it?" Edward finally asked. "Has something got you worried?" Mother offered him a thin smile. "Just the storm, my dear. These are hardly the best conditions for travel." Edward reached across the carriage and patted her hand. He was newly 15 and confident he could handle anything the world might throw at them, even the greatest forces of nature. "We'll be home soon, Mother. And there's no need for worry. Not as long as I'm—" That was the last thing Edward remembered. When he came to, his vision was foggy, his mind confused. It was still raining. But he was outside. In the dirt. "Mother," Edward tried to say. He began coughing instead. "Here! I'm here, my love!" Edward tried to turn towards the voice, but while he'd previously been numb to all but the rain, the motion sent a sharp pain through his leg below the knee. He cried out, "Stay still, Edward." Mother's voice was thin, strained. "The coachman has gone to fetch help. We must be still until he returns." "All right," Edward managed. It was hard to keep the tears out of his voice. It was also hard to know how much time had passed. If anything, it only rained harder. Edward's face was mushed into the slick muck of the road that must have, in part, caused their crash. He and Mother were both trapped under the overturned carriage. He also knew he was losing and gaining consciousness as the rain beat down on him. "Love, can you hear me?" Mother's voice again, dimmer. "Yes." "You need to stay awake." "I'm trying." "Promise me you'll stay awake, all right?" Then she said, "I'll sing to you." "Yes, Mother." This time Edward was sure he was crying. It was hard to tell for all the rain beating against his cheeks, but his throat was thick. Mother started in on a lullaby. Edward couldn't entirely make out the tune despite his best attempts at concentration. She wasn't singing really, just humming. Edward strained, desperate to focus, to hear her voice, to listen. But he was fading again, Itze, and there was nothing he could do. Edward woke with a jolt, heart pounding. It took him a moment to realize he was at home in his room. Yes, it was storming outside. The rain beat angrily against his window, but he was here, safe, alive, alone. His breathing quieted, and he took stock of himself. Though the loss of his left leg had been nearly 7 years ago to the day, the phantom pains were back. It wasn't unusual for the discomforting sensations to return in half-lucid moments between sleep and wakefulness, but combined with the recollections inspired by the storm. Edward felt tears threaten to fall. The night of the accident, after Edward lost consciousness one final time, the coachman at last returned with help. It had been a long walk to the nearest village, and when assistance arrived, Mother was already gone. Edward hadn't been able to attend the funeral, as he was still recovering following the loss of his leg. Father, however, didn't hesitate to loom over his son's sick bed and proclaim, "If you'd had the strength to free your own self from the wreckage, perhaps the outcome would have been different." The Edward from the previous week might have protested. especially at Robert's cold nod of assent from his place at father's right arm. The new Edward could only silently agree. And the Edward of today wasn't much better. He willed himself to go back to sleep, but with the storm still raging, such a feat proved impossible. In the end, he pulled himself into a sitting position and lit the candle left at his bedside. The serving staff always left him materials to relight it himself, as waking up in the night was a common occurrence. The light shone dimly on the table and reflected off his wooden leg, which was propped beside the table for easy access. The tiny glow was enough to soothe Edward's spirits, if only slightly. He cracked the spine of the new book he'd intended to leave for tomorrow and resolved to lose himself in the pages, where the storm could not follow. Chapter 1. The alley behind the inn smelled of rot and waste, but Margaret hardly noticed. She'd been swept away in her latest read, a thrilling tale of romance and adventure. With a building sense of dread, she flipped to the last page, read to the last line, and closed the back cover. It was over. Margaret took a deep breath and tried to get her bearings as reality took over once more. It was always so strange, coming out of the dream of a good story. Just moments ago, in the luxurious sprawl of her imagination, she'd been storming through the hills on horseback, caught up in the arms of a dashing gentleman. Now. The door to the alley swung open. Nick, the other cook, threw out a bucket of soiled water. Margaret had to leap out of the way to avoid soaking the bottom of her dress. "You might watch yourself," Margaret said, with the book hanging limply at her side. "You might do your job," Nick replied. His eyes were teasing, though. "If I get any more extra practice with these recipes, I'll surpass your mastery. Best be on guard, Miss Andrews." Margaret felt her face flush. She looked away. Mastery, hardly. "I mean it. That's what all the patrons are saying. Rupert as well." Margaret flushed deeper still. Rupert, an old friend of Margaret's late father, had been the one to offer her the job as a cook in the first place. They were relatively close, but he rarely tossed around compliments on a whim. "Thank you," Margaret said at last, ignoring the unexpected prick of tears. She'd been shown such generosity by Rupert and his wife, Johanna. It was hard not to show how deeply their assistance still affected her. Nick pressed his lips together and nodded, perhaps a little uncomfortable, and returned to the kitchen. Once he was gone, Margaret allowed herself to slump forward and feel what her heart was demanding. She was fortunate to be here. She knew that. But it was hardly so simple. This wasn't how she'd imagined her life unfolding, for one. And sometimes she missed father with such an intensity, it felt as if her ribs were cracking in her chest, jagged shards digging into her soft insides. He'd been a gambler and a drunkard. Many times Margaret had half carried him to his chamber, helped him to bed. But he'd been hers. Now she had no one. "That's not true," Margaret muttered fiercely, before the tears could really take hold. "You have Rupert and Johanna. They've done more than right by you. You'd best do right by them." With that, Margaret folded her book under her arm and followed after Nick. Wash, chop, stir. Some seasoning here. A splash of broth there. Plating dishes to appeal to the eye. Imagining with all the might of her senses the pleasure her efforts would bring the inn's patrons. The kitchen inspired a familiar dance. Margaret wasn't completely unhappy at the Royal Lion after all. The patrons were kindly, and she was on friendly terms with many of the regulars, who often made attempts to compliment her personally. It had gotten so that she knew many of their orders by heart, and it brought her a small spark of joy each time a guest returned and requested the same dish again. Laughs were shared here, smiles, warmth. But by the end of each day there was no denying Margaret was tired, her feet aching, the small muscles supporting her shoulders overly tense from stirring and lifting. "Miss Andrews," Rupert said, and Margaret looked up from the counter she'd been cleaning. "It's time I locked up." Margaret's eyes ticked to the window that looked out onto the street. When had it gotten dark? My apologies, sir. She stepped back from the counter and ducked her head. Time must have gotten away from me. There was a smile in Rupert's voice when he answered. It's been about a month now, hasn't it? How would you say you're faring? Well, almost. Thank you again for the opportunity. Miss Andrews. Rupert inclined his head as if to say, Are you quite sure, child? Margaret smiled sadly. I have been well as can be expected. It's painful still sometimes. I would imagine so. I wasn't myself for months after the passing of my father. Years, when my mother's time came. Margaret nodded slightly but held her tongue. Her own mother had died in childbirth. As a girl, she'd thought she'd held grief for her mother's premature passing. But now she knew that feeling was nothing more than nostalgia for what she'd never known. Grief meant longing for what you'd once had. In any case, said Rupert, when it became clear Margaret didn't intend to respond, I hope you know how grateful we are to have you here. You've been doing a phenomenal job in the kitchen. I haven't been counting exactly, but even just this last week our patronage seems to have increased. More folks are enjoying themselves enough to return. I would imagine if that is the case, it's because of your savvy business sense. Ah, perhaps, Rupert smiled and waved a finger at Margaret. I'm not so lacking in pride that I won't take a kind word from a charming woman, but in truth I'm certain it's a combination of both. The warmth in Rupert's eyes made something heal in Margaret just a little. Thank you. Both of you, she said, meaning Johanna as well. Rupert nodded in acknowledgement. I'll pass your kind thanks along. Then, as he was turning to leave, he said, I'll leave your payment on the main table in the dining room. Enough for tonight. Get some rest, Miss Andrews. Margaret was tempted to do precisely as Rupert suggested and leave the rest of resetting the kitchen for the morning. But a job wasn't done until it was done. She finished wiping the counter, then moved on to tidying the dining room itself. The moon was high outside the window by the time she pocketed her pay and returned to the quarters Rupert had leased her for a fraction of the typical price. She prepared a humble dinner for herself and read by candlelight far longer than was responsible. When she finally collapsed into bed, her eyes and body were heavy, but her soul felt lightened. With cool night air breezing in, Margaret slipped away into a land of fantasy, not so far removed from the fictional world she'd just left behind. Chapter 2. After breakfast the following morning, Edward retired to his study to continue the book he'd begun the night before. He hadn't expected to be so taken by the first chapter in that impossible-to-put-down sort of way. A knock came on the study door. "Come in," Edward called. Ruby, the maid, poked her head in. "My lord, the doctor is here." Edward sighed and closed the book. Perhaps his deep dive into the forays of this latest fiction had less to do with the quality of the book itself. Though it was a stirring narrative, there was no denying that. And more to do with what he wanted to avoid in reality. "Very well. I'll be there momentarily. Thank you, Ruby." Ruby began to leave, then hesitated. "Should I fetch Miss Rebecca as well?" Edward considered this. His sister was surprisingly mature for a girl of only 8, and when it was just the two of them, she could contribute to discussions far beyond her years. Even so. Best not, Edward decided. I do not want her worrying any more than necessary. Ruby nodded and left. Edward set the book aside and followed suit. As he moved down the long, ornate hallways of the home reserved for the Duke of Somerset, his father, Thomas Lockwood, Edward prepared himself for what would surely be a heated meeting. "Finally, decided to grace us with your presence, have you?" Robert sniped from his place at father's bedside. "At least I'm dressed and presentable," Edward deadpanned back. "What hour did you return to us last night? Or was it this morning?" Do keep your envy to yourself, dear brother. The physician they had called didn't acknowledge Edward's entrance or comment, instead keeping his attention on examining the Duke, who, 3 days past, had fallen inexplicably ill with a respiratory ailment. Well, perhaps not inexplicably. The Duke had neglected his health a great deal these past few years. It wasn't terribly surprising that eventually all the drinking and smoking caught up with him. Robert, judging from his scoundrel-like, rankled appearance, was not horribly far behind. Sometimes even Edward had a difficult time believing they were twins. "Well," said the physician at long last, sitting back and adjusting his spectacles. "As it stands, His Grace's lungs are partially functional, and barely that." He made eye contact with Robert, then Edward, then Robert again, and said with intensity, "If he is to have any hope of recovery, he must remain in bed, avoid physical activity, and above all else, avoid smoking." Edward looked back at his sleeping father in surprise. This made it sound as if father were dying, not merely a bit under the weather. But when Edward looked closer, he noticed with greater clarity the paper-thin look of father's sallow skin and the laboured wheeze of his breath. "Good Lord," Robert said, looking a little shaken himself. Edward answered the physician. "I will make sure he goes by your advice. Thank you for venturing all this way so early." "It is my honour, my lord," said the physician with a short bow. Ruby, who had been lingering outside the door, stepped inside His Grace's chambers. "May I escort you out, Mr. Acker?" The physician left with Ruby. Edward and Robert were alone with their ill father. A swell of dread and damned longing overtook Edward, and he found himself kneeling suddenly by his father's bedside. The Duke opened his eyes just slightly and mumbled something before closing them again. He was drifting in and out of consciousness, and it was unlikely he was lucid, but Edward couldn't help himself. "Are you all right, father?" Robert snorted from behind him. "Are you all right, father?" he mimicked. "Don't bother acting afraid now or trying to butter him up. Bad blood has been running between the two of you for far too long." Edward kept himself very still, bad blood boiling indeed. In moments like these, he was almost grateful for his disability. If he'd had both of his legs and half a chance at winning the fight, there would be little stopping him from attacking his brother outright. "You speak for yourself," Edward said, miraculously managing to keep his voice level. "I, despite what you think, care for the man." The Duke blinked again, slowly, but if he had anything to add to the discussion, it was lost to weakness and fever. Robert huffed a derisive laugh. Edward finally risked looking up to see his brother's face, twisted in disdain. They had been born identical, but by now that past reality mattered little. Robert had both his legs, so anyone who cared to look would easily be able to tell them apart. And more than anything else, Robert's expressions cycled between dark glee and rage. Edward didn't know how his own expressions made him come across, but he was almost positive it wasn't that. What had happened to Robert to make him like this? "What are you staring at?" Robert demanded, when he noticed Edward's scrutiny. He turned his eyes heavenward, making a show of it. "You really couldn't be any more pathetic, could you?" Edward pressed his lips together, determined not to take the bait. Robert eventually shook his head and left the room, hopefully to get presentable to face the day and any guests who might come calling. Robert, after all, was to be father's heir. The forward-facing roles of the household consistently fell to the able-bodied twin without debate. With Robert gone, the room went quiet. The only sound was the knocking of the wind against the window and father's fitful sleep. Edward couldn't stand to be here another moment. It took some effort to stand up again. He was glad Robert had gone before he'd made the attempt, and left his father's bedchambers. Initially he meant to return to the study and continue reading, but when he reached the threshold he found it wasn't just his father's chambers he wished to escape, but the house in its entirety. "I'll return shortly," Edward told Ruby minutes later, on his way out the front door. Shall I make sure to have lunch at the ready? No, thank you. I'll eat while I'm away. Outside the grandiose frame of the Lockwood family home, London was alight with people going about their days, whether those activities involved work or frolic or some combination. The sky was an unusually bright blue for early spring, with hardly a cloud to mar the robin's egg expanse of sunny pastel colour. The scent of fresh flowers covered the less savoury smells of the city, and the air felt fresh on Edward's skin. It was the morning after a storm. Edward made a right at the gate and adopted the slow, measured pace he always took when he left the house. At home, while he hated to be caught doing it by father or Robert and reprimanded, it was permissible to walk a little less straight, a little more casually. Outside, Edward didn't dare. No, out here he walked straight and tall. An attempt at regality, or at least wholeness and propriety. He tried to stay focused on his posture to make sure he was smiling and nodding in greeting at anyone he passed. This way their attention would be drawn to his face, and not the somewhat noisy prosthetic that began at his knee and kept him upright. It was no use. Edward couldn't get his mind off of father. And not just father, but Rebecca as well. He was close with Rebecca in a way father and Robert simply were not. Robert thought the little girl was dim, improper, obnoxious. Edward knew Rebecca was in truth merely a touch shy. Regardless if father failed to recover from his illness and Robert inherited the estate. Well, who was to say Robert wouldn't turn both him and Rebecca out on the street? No, Edward muttered to himself. He's your brother. As if that had ever made any difference when it came to Robert. Eventually Edward found himself in front of the Royal Lion Oyster Bar, his intended destination. He usually went further up the road to a different oyster bar, but he never travelled by carriage anymore if he could help it, and he was tired from staying up most of the night reading. Besides that, the weariness of this new drama with his brother was already leaching its way into his bones. He would make do with eating here, even if it was Robert's usual hangout. It was nearly noon, and the Royal Lion was relatively full. It was a nice establishment, clean, with a fair amount of embellishment and a red and gold colour scheme. Edward spotted a secluded corner table and hastened to claim it as quickly as his prosthetic would allow. This way he could enjoy the food without having to worry about people staring at his leg. The wood of his prosthetic leg was always visible through the hem of his breeches, and the noise it gave under each step made Edward cringe inwardly. The sort of people frequenting an establishment such as this was familiar, to say the least. High-born, gossipy, entitled. Edward was sure many of them knew his family, though not many knew him personally. Edward preferred to keep to himself. That at least had been true of him even before the accident. Edward turned his eyes off the other patrons and studied the menu. Once he'd made up his mind, he glanced up, hoping to catch the eye of a server to place an order. And there she was. A young woman, blonde, slim and green-eyed. She was aesthetically stunning, beautiful in a way he'd never seen before. But it wasn't just her appearance. No, it was something in the way she moved, a sort of dignified grace that suited her so well Edward couldn't imagine it on anyone else. Then there was her face, too. She was talking with a family at a table several spaces away from Edward's, laughing and joking, like joy and a zest for conversation were her defaults. But when the young woman left the table, her face darkened, just a little. It was a private look, the sort of look she probably didn't imagine anyone else taking notice of. There was an unexpected somberness there, a twist of sadness and stress. Who is this young woman? Edward thought. And what circumstances is she living in to prompt such simultaneous joy and grief? Edward hadn't voiced these questions out loud, but the girl must have felt his eyes on her because she turned from her original path back towards the kitchen and scanned until she caught his gaze. Edward felt his face grow warm. He offered a small, hopefully not too embarrassed smile and a short nod. The young woman's face tightened. The tightness turned to a glare. Edward frowned, confused. The young woman shook her head, dismissing him, and returned to the kitchen. Edward could do nothing but sit there. He felt like he'd been bucked from a horse. An unusual feeling, drawn up from an old memory, as of course he hadn't mounted a horse since he was a boy of 15. How had a stranger had such an effect on him? Had he done something to merit her glare? "Ah, Robert," came a voice to Edward's left. He was accustomed to being recognised as his brother on the odd occasions he did venture into the world willingly, so he turned in answer to the name. It was Lord William Beauchamp, Robert's friend from childhood. There'd been a time when they were very small that the three of them had played together. But both Robert and William had taken to hunting and other athletics with an interest Edward never understood. By the time they had properly begun their studies, William might as well have been Robert's twin in Edward's place. "Lord Beauchamp," Edward greeted him with stiff politeness. "I suppose I ought to have expected running into you here." William's smile froze. The two women who accompanied him exchanged a glance. "Edward," he said at last, "my apologies." "It's no matter. The booth was obstructing your view." "Yes, well." William ticked his eyes to one of the women at his side. Usually William had no qualms about digging in at Edward in the same way Robert did. Whether he was holding back now because he was in the company of women or because Robert wasn't here to offer approval couldn't be known. "I suppose I'll see you some other time, then." "I suppose so." William offered a curt, slightly awkward nod, then left with his two companions. Edward watched him go. What an unusual and mysterious man. Chapter 3. Margaret let out a breath when she returned to the kitchen. 1 minute she'd been having a fine day, typical if busy. The next he was here again, that scoundrel Marquess who always gave her such a hard time. "He's back?" Nick asked from his place at the counter. He'd been chopping onions to add to the beef stew. Margaret could only nod mutely. Nick brought his knife down a little harder than usual. "It isn't fair that you have to be the one dealing with him so often." "What's all this now?" Rupert asked, squeezing through the kitchen door behind Margaret. "Miss Andrews, I noticed you on your way back into the kitchen just now, and it seemed as if something had given you a fright. Are you quite all right?" "I'm fine," Margaret managed, and straightened herself up. She didn't like having all this attention on her. Besides, the man had only stared at her from across the room today. Usually when she waited on the Marquess and his friends, he was much bolder, leering at her, or even grabbing her wrist when she set down a plate. Once, when she'd been on her way home for the evening, he and his friends had followed her some distance, laughing and jeering. They'd herded her into a darkened street and could have forced her into something awful, had it not been for the evening patrol making their rounds. Rupert frowned, unconvinced. "Why don't you take a break? Eat something." "Oh no," said Margaret, hustling around him to join Nick at the counter. There were other ingredients that needed to be chopped, surely something she could fill her hands with. "We're too busy for that just now. I'll eat later." Nick snatched the extra knife off the counter before Margaret could claim it. "I think Rupert and I both insist. I can cover here. Right, Rupert?" "Indeed. Nick, be so kind as to pour Miss Andrews a bowl of that stew, would you?" Before Margaret could protest further, Nick was passing a warm, sloshing bowl of savoury beef stew into her hands. "Go eat," both men said at once. Margaret felt a little knot of tension between her shoulders release itself. Often she didn't know when she was getting overwhelmed by stress until it was already too late. An increasingly familiar wave of gratitude came over her. How fortunate she was to have such good people looking out on her behalf. "I suppose a few minutes wouldn't hurt," Margaret allowed. Both Rupert and Nick smiled, pleased. Rupert retreated to the main dining hall to continue hosting the guests, while Nick resumed chopping more vegetables to add to the pot. His manner was a little calmer now, a little more like he was truly just cooking a meal, and less like he was practicing to dismember someone. Margaret took her stew to the staff room. She sat at the weathered table wedged between the supply shelves and took tiny sips of the scalding broth, while paging back to where she'd left off in her latest read. Usually Margaret didn't read in the staff room, preferring the alley outside the inn, out of fear that Rupert might come inside and decide she'd secretly been a slacker all this time. It was a poor way to demonstrate her thanks for how good he'd been to her. Then again, Margaret did get overwhelmed sometimes by the bustle of the inn and the occasional cruel customer. The best way to counter that was a moment or two to herself, or better yet, a moment with the latest cast of characters who had nestled their way up close to her heart. Rupert never came out into the alleyway. What he didn't know wouldn't hurt him. But for now, as Margaret ate her stew and ventured deeper into the narrative of her novel, she was content to just sit for a moment and take a much-needed break. What was wrong with that Marquess, anyway? One might think he was just too attached to the drink. Margaret, however, was more than accustomed to dealing with drunkards. She couldn't count the number of times she'd had to venture out at night to escort her drunken father out of whatever establishment he'd chosen for his latest descent into debauchery. This wasn't that. The Marquess had an intentional air of maliciousness about him. Margaret sighed and set her book aside. Her thoughts lingered on those late nights with father. In those instances, even drunk, he'd been a solid presence there with her in the face of men with potentially ill intentions, a protector, or at least someone whose presence said to the world, "This one is spoken for." She'd never been attacked outright before being orphaned. "Yes, now I have Rupert and Nick," Margaret thought, "but I'm an employee here, not a daughter or a wife. I cannot rely on them forever, can I?" Chapter 4. For once, Edward found it difficult to focus on his reading. He couldn't get the young woman from the oyster bar out of his head. The way she had carried herself, so confident and sure. And then the fiery way she had looked at him.
Before we continue into the story, do us a favor. Like this video and hit the subscribe button because it helps very much with YouTube's algorithm. If you want the audiobooks ads free, visit our website and select our bundles to save more. Thank you again. Now back to our story.
Well, no wonder he couldn't shake the memory of her. She was, quite possibly, the most beautiful woman Edward had ever seen. He couldn't say precisely why exactly, just that there was something special, different about her. Many women had approached him over the years, women of all statuses, even with his disability. He supposed, in a technical sense, he was still a promising match, going by his family's status alone. But none of the other women had caught his attention quite like this. Someone knocked lightly on the study door. Edward marked his page and looked up, prepared to tell whoever it was to come in, but Rebecca was already shoving the door open. Her face was red, her eyes and nose wet. Edward!" Edward got to his feet as quickly as he could with the prosthetic. "Rebecca, what's wrong?" He held open his arms to her, and she ran to him, hugging him tightly around the waist and crying into his shirt. For a girl of 8, her grip was surprisingly strong. "Robert." "What has he done, dear girl?" She sniffled and said something into Edward's stomach. Edward petted her hair. "Rebecca, please speak clearly. I want to help." She pulled back and wiped at her eyes. She took a hiccuping breath and then another. "Robert says he's getting rid of Dorothy. He said she was getting too old and called her useless." Dorothy was Rebecca's governess. Edward was upset, but in all honesty, hardly shocked. Of course Robert would pull something like this. Usually, though, it was to Edward's detriment, not Rebecca's. "That's outrageous," Edward said through gritted teeth. "She's the kindest woman of all." He looked down at his sister. "You stay here. I will have a word with him immediately." Edward patted Rebecca's head one last time before storming out into the hall. He heard voices from around the corner that led into the foyer and followed them to find Robert and William conversing, presumably on their way out for the evening. "Good evening, William," Edward said without even looking him in the eye. Right now, all of his attention was on Robert. "And you, brother? Have you no decency? Do you care about our sister's education? Even slightly?" Robert eyed Edward up and down. Only then did Edward realize he'd backed his brother against the wall. Robert offered a derisive smile. This regards the governess, I take it. Do not play me, Robert, or so help me God. What will you do? Robert's voice was quiet, cold. Or rather, what can you do, my poor crippled brother? Behind Edward, William laughed. Edward looked back over his shoulder and glared. It was enough to get William to quiet, but there was still that mirthful look in his eyes. Monsters, the both of them. Father will certainly object to this, Edward threatened, voice low. William laughed again, this time louder, imbued with even more arrogance. Robert himself just scoffed. Father is already informed. He agrees we must get rid of anyone who isn't of use, and it isn't as if that little imp of a sister is learning anyway. Robert said that last bit as if he expected Edward to agree. Edward knit his brow, puzzled, but then he heard a quiet gasp behind him, followed by light, quickly retreating feet. Rebecca must have been listening in. Edward gave Robert a single shove before turning to go after Rebecca, or perhaps more pressingly, confirm Father's intentions for himself. You are heartless, he hissed. Yes, well, Robert said, chuckling as Edward retreated. Do take care to watch your step, brother. You wouldn't want to lose another leg while running to Father. Father, Dorothy is like a mother to Rebecca. You couldn't possibly fire her after all these years of service, said Edward, at his father's bedside once more. Father was better today than he had been the day before. He was sitting up and could speak a little, though his energy came and went at irregular intervals. With wheezes between words, he answered his son. It is useless to waste any further effort in this manner. I don't have the energy for re-examining decisions that have already been made. There's nothing at all Dorothy can do to sway you. Besides turning back the clock, no, she's too old, losing her touch. Rebecca needs a better governess, one with experience and the enthusiasm of youth. Carefully, Edward asked, is that what a father wants for his daughter? Or something that would serve Robert's interest? Father balked. How dare you speak of your brother in such a manner? Robert isn't the issue here, Father. It is of Rebecca's interest I'm concerned. But Father had said his last bit with such intensity it had sent him into a coughing fit. Edward cut himself off to allow Father to regain his composure. Tentatively he reached a hand out, as if to pat Father on the back, to help. Father waved him off. My decision is final, he wheezed. Leave me. Father, I said leave. Edward jerked back. Stiffly, barely containing his rage, he stood. Very well. I wish you a swift recovery. Father didn't respond. He'd returned to coughing full out. But if he didn't want Edward's help, well, Edward had done enough begging. He left the bedchamber and returned to his study. He paced back and forth, loath to sit still, despite the discomfort caused by the prosthetic. Drat! Edward yelled, when he could take it no more. He grabbed a thick book off the side table and hurled it across the room. It knocked into a globe and then thudded onto the floor, open-faced, its pages pulled and twisted at odd angles. Edward felt immediate regret. The one solace he had was his library. He went to the book and picked it up. After smoothing the wrinkled pages, he held it to his chest and bowed his head. He needed to calm down and think of something positive. Re-evaluate from there. He would not let Robert's attempt to render him feeling useless, helpless, succeed. He thought of the girl from the oyster bar. Before Edward had consciously made up his mind to do what he was about to, he found himself leaving the study, walking down the hall, and then leaving the house altogether. He turned right at the gate, just as he had the day before. The Royal Lion was but a short walk away. Chapter 5. The day was quieter than usual. It wasn't that Margaret didn't want the Royal Lion's business to thrive, but it was nice every now and then to have the chance to play catch-up. Orders were few and manageable, and she was able to send out every patron's food in a timely manner. She was busy preparing the pickled salmon for one of their regulars when Rupert entered the kitchen. "Miss Andrews, when you have a minute, there is a customer who wishes to speak with you." "Of course," Margaret said, though her pulse picked up at the pronouncement. Had she done something wrong? "I'll be there momentarily." Margaret got to a stopping point with the preparation of her current dish. She wiped off her hands, then left the kitchen to meet up with Rupert and whoever this customer was. She stopped in her tracks. It was him. The vile, rude, ill-mannered Marquess who had repeatedly harassed her with his words and actions. Only now did Margaret realise she had never directly pointed out the man who caused her such discomfort to Rupert. He thought this was just another regular patron, or more than that, a regular patron with money. "Greetings," the man began, while Margaret stood frozen. "I wanted to sincerely congratulate you for your superb skills preparing this meal." Margaret's tongue felt thick in her mouth. How to respond? Just then, a new, large group entered the inn, laughing boisterously. Rupert smiled and nodded at both Margaret and the man. "Excuse me, my lord, I must see to an urgency." Rupert left to greet these new patrons. Margaret was alone with the man. Silence stretched between them. "How are you?" the Marquess asked, in a tentative, slightly awkward way Margaret hadn't expected. Was he acting this way out of some sort of puppy-dog attempt at remorse? If so, Margaret didn't want to hear it. "Thank you for your compliments," she finally said flatly, and turned to leave. A touch grazed the back of her hand. Instinctively, Margaret turned and slapped him. The silence returned, now thick with Margaret's shock at herself and embarrassment. The whole room had gone quiet, even the boisterous group Rupert had just seated. Margaret cast her eyes around for her employer, expecting her mortification to expound tenfold. Thankfully, he must have returned to the kitchen or the staff room. The Marquess touched his reddened cheek, stunned. "How have I offended you, miss?" How had he? The audacity! Margaret felt tears threaten. She shouldn't confront him here, not in the dining hall, not in front of all these people. But she couldn't hold back any longer. Lowly, she hissed, "Today or all the other occasions you and your friend Lord Beauchamp have tried to have your way with me." The Marquess looked even more confused for a moment, but then his eyes darkened. "You must have mistaken me for my brother. This is only my second time here." Oh, what a line! Margaret shook her head angrily, indicating she was done with this conversation, and turned to leave. The Marquess risked touching her hand once more. "Please, I'm telling you the truth," he said, even as Margaret jerked back a second time. "I am Edward Lockwood, the crippled twin. It is my brother Robert who has been causing you this grief." The Marquess gestured to his leg as he hiked up the leg of his trousers. Margaret would not have noticed had she not been looking for it, but it was true. A prosthetic marked the place where the lower half of his left leg would have been. "Oh," Margaret's snappy response dried up in her mouth. "I'm so sorry," she said, feeling rather light-headed. How awful to have forced a man to bring attention to his disability as proof of honesty. The Marquess, Lord Edward, cleared his throat. "Please don't worry yourself. I know better than most how vile my brother can be, and I wouldn't disagree had you reacted worse by my misunderstood advancement. I should apologise." At some point, the patrons of the Royal Lion had gone back to their earlier conversations, likely having become uncomfortable themselves with the skirmish unfolding near the kitchens. Margaret studied this other, more gentlemanly Marquess, and re-evaluated their conversation, now that she knew what she did. He'd complimented her cooking. "My name is Margaret Andrews," she said warmly. Lord Edward beamed. "Edward Lockwood. It is a genuine pleasure, Miss Andrews." Margaret found herself surprised by this reaction, but taken nonetheless. His brother, Robert, always glowered, or if he did smile, there was a vicious sort of glee to it. Edward's smile was bright, lovely, if perhaps a little shy. Oh, but what an airy, fruitless notion. Why on earth would a Marquess feel shy around the likes of her? A third silence, this one awkward in the ways the others were not. Margaret wanted to stay and continue speaking with Edward, but tables were filling up. She needed to get back to the kitchen. Edward must have caught on to her internal debate, because after a moment of looking unsure himself, he took a step forward and in a rush said, "Do you serve desserts here as well?" He lifted an eyebrow, tentatively playful. Margaret saw the excuse for what it was and had to laugh. "Why, yes, Lord Edward, we most certainly do." The evening picked up speed after that. Edward returned to one of the few remaining empty tables, a secluded booth towards the back of the room, while Margaret ventured back to the kitchen. Nick was cooking up a storm, covering for Margaret, as several new orders had piled up while she'd been speaking with Edward. "I'll handle the seafood dishes, if you'll keep on with that fresh batch of stew," Margaret offered, jumping back into the action at the counter. Nick reached an arm past her to grab some spices off the rack. "You sure you're up for it? I saw you talking to that man. You seemed to hold your own, but I wanted to make certain." It wasn't the same man. "What do you mean?" "Apparently," said Margaret, organising supplies for the dishes in her queue, "the monstrous Marquess has a twin brother. The one who has been giving me trouble is Robert. This one, Edward, just went out of his way to compliment my cooking." Nick stopped chopping and gave Margaret an incredulous look. "I know," said Margaret, hoping the collar of her dress covered the blush creeping up her neck. She pushed the seafood supplies to the back of her workspace. First, she intended to prepare the Royal Lion's finest dessert. Edward took his time eating after Margaret brought the food out. She thought it only fitting to deliver the dish personally, as acknowledgement of his earlier kindness. And if she lingered at his table a little longer than necessary, well, who could blame her for enjoying the presence of such a delightful gentleman? Then later, just as she was reaching down to take back the empty dessert plate, Margaret's eyes caught sight of something wondrous. "Is that the new Austen?" Margaret asked, nodding to the book at Edward's side. Why had she even bothered asking? Of course it was. She had an identical copy stored away right now with her belongings in the staff room. Edward's eyes brightened further. "You've read it?" "I'm about halfway through right now." "Then that's even farther than me. You mustn't tell me what happens." "And ruin all the grand suspense? Never!" They both laughed. It wasn't that the conversation was particularly funny, but neither Rupert nor Nick cared much for reading. Margaret hadn't had someone to share her love of books with since father passed away. The realization came with a dull ache in her chest. Even so, her newfound sense of joy didn't dissipate. If anything, at the sight of the laughter at the edge of Edward's eyes, it grew. "I'm so sorry for departing so abruptly earlier," Rupert said, coming up to the table. "We had a delivery arrive earlier than expected that ended up sweeping my attention." "That's perfectly all right," said Edward, as he counted out his payment. He set the money on the table and looked at Margaret. "I was glad for the opportunity to continue speaking with Miss Andrews." "And I as well," Margaret answered. "I do hope we will meet again. It seems there is plenty between us that merits further discussion." Rupert looked between them. "Well," he said after a moment, "thank you, my lord, for your patronage. Can I assist you on your way out?" "No, thank you," said Edward, climbing out of the booth with relative ease. Margaret imagined he must have already had years of practice navigating life with the prosthetic. As she stepped to the side to allow him to exit, she subtly scanned Edward up and down, looking for other differences between him and his vile brother. Edward was certainly the gentleman of the two, there was no denying that. But he was also, perhaps, slightly taller, his jawline sharper, his eyes kinder. "Farewell, Miss Andrews," Edward said with a short incline of his head. "And farewell to you, Lord Edward." Once Edward was gone, Margaret returned to the kitchen once more. Her thoughts, however, remained fixated on their encounter. One thing was absolutely certain. Edward's legs spoiled nothing. He was as equally handsome and charming as any man with 2 legs. No, he was more so. Chapter 6. Edward's heart felt light after leaving the Royal Lion, but it wasn't long before his thoughts darkened again. His brother truly was a despicable man, wasn't he? To think, not only had Robert's actions almost spoiled Edward's first true conversation with Margaret, but from what she'd said, he'd horrible, disgraceful. Never had Edward felt so ashamed to share both name and appearance with his brother. He will not threaten her again, Edward said to himself low under his breath. There was no one around presently to hear. Still, it felt binding in a way, making this sort of commitment out loud. Never, not if I can help it. Margaret, opposite to Robert, couldn't be more of a delight. An educated woman who carried herself with class, despite her lack of societal status. She read books, loved to cook, and cooked quite splendidly at that. Edward wanted to see her again. Not only that, he wanted to get to know more about her. What was she passionate about? Who were the loved ones in her life? What did she hope for her future? Perhaps, in turn, she would want to know him as well. Edward stopped walking. He was nearly home, but he was tired and admittedly emotionally overwhelmed. For so long, when it came to women, or anyone really, Edward had laboured under the assumption that he would be an inconvenience to them at best, or that they would agree to be with him only for his money and title. But with Margaret, their conversation had come so easily. They shared so many of the same interests. Perhaps there was a chance, even just a small one, that she could feel affection for him as he did for her. If that miracle were to come to pass, Robert could inherit all their father's assets, all the titles and property and responsibility. Edward wouldn't care. "Why do you have such a foolish grin on your face?" Robert asked the next morning at breakfast. It was just him, Edward and Rebecca at the table as father was still confined to his bedchamber. "You look positively oafish." Rebecca's eyes ticked between her brothers before her gaze landed and stayed on her barely picked-at plate of food. A part of Edward bristled on her behalf. Leave it to Robert to make what was meant to be a pleasant family mealtime a sour start to the day. Rebecca should feel free to converse at the table, to share with them any new interests that had caught her attention, or what she was learning from her tutelage. But Edward was determined not to let Robert get to him today. Maybe if he stood up to his brother, even in small ways, it would help Rebecca feel more confident against him as well. "If I look oafish, you do as well," Edward said, after swallowing a bite of biscuit and jam. "At least I'm a happy oaf." Rebecca giggled. Robert shot her a glare. She wilted again. Edward added, "You're a scowly oaf." This time Rebecca snorted and covered her mouth. Whether it was to hide her returned gaiety or avoid spewing food, Edward wasn't sure, but he felt positively buoyant. Rebecca had been so low since father's verdict about Dorothy. It was good to see her smiling once more. Robert, however, wasn't smiling in the slightest. He got to his feet and threw his napkin on the table. "This right here is why we need a new governess." He narrowed his eyes at Rebecca. "It's high time the brat learned her manners." With that, Robert stormed away. A member of the kitchen staff nearly dropped the plate she was carrying when he passed, but somehow maintained her balance. Edward looked to Rebecca, worried Robert's biting comment would have her shrinking into herself again. It hadn't. Rebecca looked up at Edward, a smile in her eyes, and dabbed at the crumbs on her glee-pursed lips. Edward had intended to wait at least one full day before returning to the Royal Lion, but breakfast left him in such a grand mood, he found himself unable to focus on anything besides the thought of returning to once again converse with the lovely Margaret. He managed to hold off until dinner time. So much for waiting an entire day. Holding off even this long felt like a minor miracle. "Well," Edward said to himself, closing his book and standing up, "it was a valiant effort." The walk to the Royal Lion felt shorter each time. perhaps because anticipation made Edward's sense of time operate at a quicker pace. When he arrived, it was more crowded than it had been the day before, but Edward still managed to procure the last open table. Of course, this wasn't his preferred secluded spot in the back of the dining hall, which meant people were more apt to stare at him as he walked over and took his place. Even with the noise of the restaurant, the noise from the mechanics in his leg did turn some heads as he walked by. But it had been 7 years, and he was used to it. Today, not even the public's pitying scrutiny could dispel his fine mood. The savoury scent of the fine dishes surrounding him reminded Edward that he was hungry for actual food as well as Margaret's company. He scanned the menu, looking to try something new. When he looked up again, there she was. She'd just exited the kitchen but stopped outright when they made eye contact. Her smile widened. Her eyes lit up. Edward felt like he was falling. His stomach was in his throat with a sudden influx of nerves and affection. He hastened to smile back, hoping he didn't look too eager. Margaret's face coloured slightly, perhaps from the heat in the kitchen, and continued on to the inn's main entrance, where she stopped to discuss something with her employer. Afterwards, Edward was surprised and delighted when Margaret headed right to his table. "Well, hello, Lord Edward. Fancy seeing you here again." I know, I'm back far too soon. I simply couldn't stay away from the food." Said Margaret, putting a hand on her hip. "That, and I imagine you're also looking to discuss the end of the new Austen novel." Edward did want to discuss that, but he'd been so distracted thinking of Margaret all day, multiple times, he'd found himself rereading the same set of sentences, absorbing nothing. "Unfortunately, I do still have several chapters left to go." Margaret gave him a sly look. "In that case, once you do finish it, I'll hope to have the pleasure of conversing with you here again." Edward would sing if his sense of pitch weren't so wanting. "It's a promise, Miss Andrews." Margaret had to return to the kitchen after that. It was quite a busy evening, but every time she left the kitchen to convene with her employer, over supplies they were short of, or new ideas for certain recipes, she made a point to stop at Edward's table and pick up from where they'd left off in their conversation. He tried to eat slowly, but even once he was done, he didn't want to leave. He ordered dessert for the second night in a row. At this rate, were he to receive any substantial inheritance, he would blow it almost immediately on sweet custards. Late day shifted to evening, and evening into night. Patrons cycled in and out, until eventually only a few tables remained occupied. Edward watched from across the room as Margaret officially shut the door for the evening, signalling to any new prospective patrons that the kitchen had closed. "Goodness," she said as she reapproached Edward's table. She shook her head, laughing slightly with exhaustion. "I am worn down to the bone." "Would you like to have a seat?" Margaret glanced back at the kitchen, hesitant. "Oh, I'm not sure." "Please," said Edward, hoping he didn't sound demanding. He desired the further pleasure of Margaret's company, but he didn't want to remind her any more of Robert than what was already unavoidable. "If your employer questions it, I will take full responsibility." Margaret still seemed a little hesitant, but took the seat across from Edward nonetheless. "You care a great deal about your employer's opinion," Edward noted. Margaret nodded. "Yes, and for his well-being. He's done a great deal for me." "Do you mind if I ask how so?" A weariness came over Margaret at his question. Edward was reminded of the first time he saw her, when she left the table with that family. The way her joy had morphed so suddenly into a private somberness. For all her mirth and smiles, perhaps Margaret was not as happy as Edward originally thought. Perhaps even Margaret wasn't as happy as she wished to envision herself. Edward understood how that could be. "My father passed away not too long ago," Margaret said at last, staring at a swollen spot on the table's wood. "My employer, Mr. Tatham, was my father's oldest friend. Though they hadn't spoken for quite some time when I came knocking on his door." She laughed, a low, sad noise, and tilted her head back, blinking away tears. When I came to London, I thought I could be a governess or even a tutor. As it turns out, just because I want something doesn't mean it wants me back. Her eyes found Edward's once again. Her smile wobbled. I don't mean to get so emotional, I'm sorry. Don't be, Edward said, all seriousness. He wished he could reach across the table and wipe the dampness from her cheeks. I lost my mother at a young age, I understand. Edward didn't add that he'd lost his mother largely due to his own weakness. Margaret's situation almost certainly didn't mirror his in that way, and he didn't want to make this moment about him. In any case, said Margaret, shaking her head and wiping at her own eyes, I was so happy just moments ago. It seems a shame for our conversation to move in such a morbid direction. Edward didn't necessarily agree, but he didn't want to force Margaret to talk about something that would bring her pain. Tell me then, what's the best book you've ever read? At that question, Margaret's smile sparked back to its usual brimming self. Oh, shame. That's a wicked thing to ask someone like me. It is. I've never been able to answer it for myself. Why should you think you can evade it now, Lord Edward? Evade it? Yes, evade it. What's your favourite book? I just admitted I don't have an answer. Margaret leaned forward, her ribcage pressed against the edge of the table. Then tell me a handful of your favourites. I find the contents of a person's bookshelf are a great measure by which to know the contents of their mind. And their heart, Edward added softly. Yes. Margaret's smile was warmth, pure warmth, and their heart. They stared at one another for a long moment. Edward felt his face growing hot. He sat back and averted his eyes, cleared his throat. I do believe I asked you first. Margaret sat back as well and hummed. All right then, let's see. She listed a handful of titles. Edward was familiar with all of them, but one in particular had a special place in his heart. It was the first book he'd finished all on his own. Mother used to read to him and Robert in the evening, her voice low, soothing. Something about this one hooked him with an intensity none of the others had quite managed. He stayed up late in secret and snuck out of the bedroom he and Robert had once shared, scampering down the hall into the study, where he found the book and tried to sound out the unfamiliar scramble of letters, guided only by the light of the full moon, urging him on through the room's lone window. The most beautiful ending, Margaret said, closing her eyes and swaying to the music of words in her mind. And to life there is no greater delight than the breeze of one's true love, Edward finished. It was the last line of the book. The last time he'd discussed this with anyone, it had been Mother all those years ago. It was a surprisingly obscure title. He'd never met anyone else who had read it all the way through. Margaret seemed to feel similarly. She pressed a hand to her heart, eyes bright. Lord Edward, you do not know it, but you've done me a great courtesy. And what's that? I never thought I would meet someone who would appreciate those words as I do, much less speak them with the reverence they deserve. Their eyes locked again. Edward adored Margaret's face, not just its features but its expressions. The brightness of her eyes when she was excited, the soft, sombre shift of her sadness, though he hated to see her in any kind of pain. And then there were her lips, lush, lovely, parted ever so slightly. Edward jerked slightly backwards, his face burned. He'd actually been so egregiously bold as to lean in. How could he have been so inappropriate, so Robert-like? This was her workplace, for goodness sake. And Margaret had been so concerned about even just sitting with him. Margaret swallowed. She looked a little frazzled as well. Undoubtedly, Edward had made her uncomfortable with his rude impulse. I suppose I should finish closing up. She looked back towards the kitchen. The main dining hall was now completely empty, with the exception of Margaret's employer counting up the day's income at a booth by the front. A robust woman with heavy-lidded eyes sat across from him. most likely his wife. Edward rose, more careful than usual not to stumble. "I apologise for keeping you so long from your duties." "It's no matter," said Margaret, but she didn't meet his eyes. "Good night, Lord Edward." With that, she turned and headed swiftly to the kitchen. Edward watched her until the heavy door swung shut between them. He stood by the now vacant booth a moment longer. Then, with a defeated sigh, left for home. Chapter 7. Margaret's pulse didn't slow the entire way home. The longer she spent in Edward's presence, the more his very essence worked its way beneath her skin, inside her. She felt in turns hot, then cold, then hot again, almost as if she had a fever. When she at last sank into bed, the vision of the way he'd looked at her just before they'd said goodbye refused to leave her. He'd looked at her lips, leaned towards her. Had he meant to kiss me? Margaret was terrified that he had not, that perhaps she'd just had a bit of something on her face. But then, when she really thought about it, perhaps the prospect that he had meant, or at least desired, to kiss her was even more frightening. He was a Marquess. She, a lowly cook. Yes, they had delightful, fulfilling, even rapturous conversations. And yes, he was kind and sweet and sensitive in ways his twin or any other man Margaret had met was not. But it could never work. If she went along with this, or even went so far as to actively pursue it, what would be the result? Undoubtedly, a ruined reputation on her end, and even less chance of ever becoming a governess, or procuring a job that relied on her intellect rather than the labour of her hands. "You must quit this obsessing over Lord Edward," Margaret whispered at herself in the dark. "That's it. That's what you'll do. You'll quit obsessing and you can still converse about books. But that will be all." Of course, when she did sleep, all her dreams were about Edward. It was a few days before he returned to the Royal Lion, and despite her promise to herself, Margaret kept getting distracted by thoughts of the kind Marquess. When would he return? Would their conversations be as stimulating as before, or would their last interaction leave them too caught up in awkwardness to continue? Once, Margaret became so caught up in her daydreams, she sliced her thumb whilst chopping vegetables. Nick sent her to the staff room with a damp rag and told her to be more careful. It's good advice, Margaret thought, in regard to more than just her injured thumb. Still, it seemed merely daydreams were not enough. Margaret kept finding excuses to peruse the main dining hall and look for him, even when there was more than plenty to do in the kitchen. Rupert eventually got tired of Margaret venturing out of her workspace so often. Kindly but firmly he told her, "My dear Miss Andrews, surely you can manage to save these updates for after hours, when we can discuss them all at once." Margaret was hardly listening. There, across the room at long last, was Edward. "Of course," she answered, "I'll take care of it." "That's not what I—" But Margaret was already crossing the dining hall to where Edward sat at the concealed booth he seemed to favour. When he caught sight of her, his eyes brightened, but then his demeanour shifted into something more guarded. Margaret's own smile wavered as she reached the table. "My lord, it's been a good spell since I last saw you here." Edward's guardedness turned to confusion. "It's been 2 days, I believe." Surely he's been gone longer than that, Margaret thought. But after a moment of actually stopping to tally the time, she realised Edward was right. Goodness. "In any case," Edward hastened to say, "it felt long to me as well, especially since, well, I do believe I owe you an apology." "An apology?" He shifted in his seat. "In our last meeting, our conversation was such a welcome departure from the discussions I usually find myself engaged in. I believe I got a little too invested." Edward met her eyes. Was he embarrassed? "My lord, you have nothing to apologise for." Margaret added as much forcefulness as she could muster without raising her voice. "Then, Almost as if sharing a secret, she said, "I too found myself invested." "Oh, why would you say such a thing?" Margaret chastised herself. To think just yesterday she'd been warning herself to be careful. Now here she was, practically throwing herself at a man so far above her status he might as well be living on a cloud. In an attempt to shift the conversation quickly away, perhaps Edward wouldn't have time to fully process what she'd just said, Margaret asked, "What sort of discussions do you usually find yourself in?" Her tactic worked. Edward's face darkened. He looked away. "Arguments, mostly. You can imagine my brother and I don't particularly get along." That Margaret could believe. Edward shook his head, as if to rid himself of unpleasant thoughts. "In any case, I did think it important to return today, not just to apologise, but to discuss the ending of the Austen novel." Margaret's heart sparked. "Oh, you finished it?" "I did." "It was excellent, wasn't it? I love all of her material, of course, but this one seems yet another step above." Margaret realised she was gushing and attempted to tone herself down. "At least those were my thoughts. I value your thoughts." "And I yours," said Margaret quickly. Only then did Edward's words really land with her. "No one has ever given me such a compliment before." Edward frowned and leaned forward. "Surely that can't be the case." "I'm afraid it is. Ridiculous. You're the most intelligent young woman I've ever met." Margaret huffed a laugh. "Tell that to the households I applied to when I first arrived in London. I'd originally hoped to work in a position that involved reading or education." She shook her head. "Difficult to come by with few contacts." Before Edward could respond, commotion cut in from across the dining hall. Margaret looked over her shoulder. Yet another large group had just poured through the front door. The Royal Lion seemed to have become quite popular for multitudinous get-togethers. "I must return to the kitchen," Margaret told Edward, not without regret. "But—" "I intend to stay for a while," Edward said. Then that look of hesitation returned. "Of course, I don't mean to assume—" "You don't need to assume," said Margaret. "Away with caution, at least in this regard. You came to discuss that ending." She smiled. "I would not be doing my job if I allowed you to make such a trip in vain." Chapter 8. "That is it," said Robert, dropping his cutlery onto his plate with a rude clatter. "We must find a replacement for that sad old hag immediately." Rebecca, who'd been humming around her breakfast, went instantly still and silent. "Tell me, what's brought on this latest display of directionless rage?" Edward asked, leaning back in his chair, trying to mirror Robert's usual enraging aloofness. "The brat is singing, at the table." "She's happy." "She's obnoxious," said Robert, glaring at their little sister. "Everything she does grates on my nerves, the way she talks, the way she dresses." He laughed, bitter and cruel. "Even when she's not doing anything at all, just sitting there like she's slow of mind, I cannot stand her stupid sunny presence." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. "'Scuse me," she mumbled, before jumping to her feet and scampering off to her room. Edward turned to Robert. He felt like an inferno raged in his chest. "Can we not have one pleasant breakfast?" "It's not my fault she's a sensitive little brat." "You must ease up, brother. What does Rebecca humming at the table have to do with a new governess anyway?" "As I've said, she needs to be taught manners." "If just her presence annoys you so, perhaps the fault lies not with our sister, but with you." In the span of a second, Robert's face went from twisted to unnervingly calm. He shrugged, sat back, took a casual bite of fruit. "Nothing is wrong with me. If anything, I'm the only one in this family with any sense of how the world really is." Edward knew it was bait. He knew it. He also couldn't help himself. "Do enlighten me. In what ways are you so worldly, and I so ignorant?" Robert's eyes glinted. "Isn't it obvious?" When Edward didn't answer, he shrugged and tossed the half-eaten fruit back on his plate, before shoving the whole dish away. You're so dreamy, so hopeful. It's nauseating." He turned his eyes toward the ceiling, as if put upon by Edward's very presence. "Honestly, you're worse than the brat, acting so hurt and surprised when real people don't behave like your storybook heroes." A memory came unbidden. It was the early years when he and Robert were small and still, truly identical. Mother always read to them in the study. They would curl up on the big seat by the window, soft sunlight drifting in. As Mother's smooth voice washed over them, Edward often closed his eyes, letting his imagination compile the images into a lovely whole. Robert, oppositely, had trouble keeping calm enough to stay seated. Once, in some adventure story, he jumped up onto the chair, unable to help himself, and demanded, "What's next? What happens next, Mother?" In the present, Edward's throat felt thick. If you tried, even once, to see more than the very worst in the world, perhaps you wouldn't be so miserable. Robert hesitated, then laughed. "Oh, the agony, the drama! Poor broken brother, how pitiable to be incapable of doing anything besides lecturing me on why I'm so miserable." He stood abruptly and swung his arms out wide. "I have no cause to be miserable. I'm soon to be Duke of Somerset, and in the meantime I'll have the pleasure of a lovely new young governess joining our staff." Edward sat back and sighed. "How have we only just had breakfast, and already I'm exhausted?" Of course his own weariness didn't matter, and he could worry about Robert's well-being later, assuming he didn't first go mad and murder his brother in his sleep. Right now, Rebecca was the one who needed an ally. "Let me choose the replacement," said Edward, setting his cutlery definitively on either side of his plate. Robert abandoned his grandiose pose and regarded Edward, surprised. "You? Why? Perhaps you're not the only one inclined to enjoy a fresh new face around the household." Robert studied him. Edward resisted the impulse to shift in his seat. All he truly cared about was finding someone who would be good for Rebecca. If the only way to do that was by playing into Robert's nonsense for a bit, so be it. Finally, Robert's face stretched into a grin. "Well, that will be entertaining. And here I'd thought women held no interest for you cripples. Is it me, or are your insults becoming less creative by the hour?" Robert tutted, unaffected. He began gathering his materials to depart, of course leaving his place setting a mess for the serving staff. "If you'd like the responsibility of choosing our sister's next tutor, by all means go ahead. It will be on you if she remains too stupid and obnoxious to ever land a respectable suitor." With that, Robert departed, leaving Edward alone in the large room. He looked down at his barely touched congealing eggs. They'd long gone cold. With a sigh, Edward shoved his seat back from the table and left for his study. It would be so much easier if Robert were a stranger. Then Edward could have a go at him properly, or better yet, ignore him altogether. Edward wasn't naive, despite what his brother thought. He knew there were bad people in the world, people beyond redemption. It was just hard, knowing his own twin was likely one of them. If Mother were still here, she would know what to do about Robert. Hell. If she were still here, perhaps Robert wouldn't have ended up like this in the first place. Stop it. Mother's gone. Living in a land of what-ifs helps no one. Edward needed to help Rebecca. His sister deserved only the best. For everything Edward couldn't control, he was determined to do right by her in this. But who? Someone educated, of course, but also kind, gentle. Rebecca was sensitive, but who could blame her? She'd grown up motherless, and given Father's distance and Robert's cruelty, no one had ever looked out for her except Edward and Dorothy. Edward opened the door to the study. There, on the side table, was the book with the gorgeous ending he and Margaret had bonded over. The previous night, he'd unearthed it from deep within the massive shelves encircling the little seating area. The sight of its worn cover left him feeling both nostalgic for the past and hopeful for the future. Rightfully so, Edward thought, as an uncontrollable smile took over his face. How could I have failed to think of her sooner? "I'm not sure," said Margaret, when they finally had a chance to converse later that afternoon. The Royal Lion was busier than ever. Word had to be getting around town about the excellent new cook. Edward felt a little guilty about trying to poach her, but hadn't Margaret hoped to become a governess upon moving to London in the first place? "Not sure?" Edward echoed, confused. "It's not that it isn't a tremendous opportunity," Margaret hastened to specify. "It's everything I've ever wanted. It's the future I've dreamed about." She bit her lip, almost as if questioning her own hesitation. "It's just, you feel loyalty to your current employer?" Margaret's eyes widened. She nodded quickly, more stressed, as if the idea had only just occurred to her at Edward's prompting. "Why, yes, that too." "But it's not your primary reason for hesitating." Margaret looked away. She fiddled with a loose thread on her dress. Was that a blush, colouring her cheeks? "No," she said quietly. "That's not my primary reason." Edward frowned, and then he understood. He'd been so excited on the way to the inn, thrilled at the prospect of seeing Margaret every day, prematurely proud of the effect he knew she would have on Rebecca. Now his ever-present rage towards his brother returned, all the more vicious for having been momentarily set aside. Edward reached out and took Margaret's hand. She jumped a little in surprise, but then allowed herself to be pulled closer to the table. To Edward. "He will not touch you, Miss Andrews. He will not insult you." Edward allowed himself to be honest with the intensity put into this promise. Truly, he would not be able to live with himself were he to put such a kind, virtuous woman in harm's way. "I will not allow it." Margaret, mouth slightly open, stared intently into Edward's eyes. There was fear in them, uncertainty. But slowly, her brow unfurrowed. "All right," Margaret said, voice serious yet soft. She squeezed his hand. "I trust you." Chapter 9. Margaret expected Edward to hail from an impressive estate. Of course, her guesswork hardly did Lockwood Manor justice. It was a stunning home, the sort of building that reminded one of a countryside vacation, despite its convenient location just outside of London's centre. The groundskeeping was impeccable, with fresh flowers lining the windows and a light, earthy scent wafting through the air. The living quarters Margaret had just vacated were far homelier. One small window, old partially rotted wood. A mouse problem. The place had been hers, though, and she'd loved it. She would miss it. Slowly, with trepidation in every step, Margaret tightened her grip on her belongings and moved towards the front entrance. She set her bag down and knocked softly on the door. It swung open immediately. A woman with red hair and drooping jowls greeted her with a sequence of nods and a big smile. "Miss Andrews, we've been expecting you." "Oh," said Margaret, a little caught off guard by the expressive greeting. This way. Let's take care to get you settled. Lots of introductions to be made, after all." The housemaid, Ruby, took Margaret's bag and escorted her up the stairs to her new sleeping quarters. It was a small but clean room, with a sizable window looking out over the courtyard. "This is lovely," Margaret said, surveying the space. She ran a hand over the bedding. Even when Father had been alive, Margaret had never had the pleasure of such nice accommodations. The previous governess had a room closer to the rest of the staff quarters, but Lord Edward insisted you were to be provided with nothing short of the best. Margaret turned and faced Ruby. The maid was looking at her shrewdly, as if she hoped Margaret might explain this seemingly odd gesture at the hands of their mutual employer. Margaret was at just as much of a loss. "You mentioned further introductions to be made?" "Of course. This way." As they manoeuvred through the decorated halls of the manor, Margaret found herself tensing up at the slightest sign of movement, nervous at the prospect of running into either of the Lockwood brothers. Edward hadn't been incorrect when he'd assumed Margaret's hesitation in accepting his offer of employment had to do with her feelings toward Robert. Even so, when he'd asked her to come and work for their family, Margaret's largest, most secret concern had been the way Edward made her feel. At turns shy and overly bold, and in either case a step removed from control of her own body. It was one thing to see Edward every day at the Royal Lion, another to be near him in his home all hours of the week. "Here we are," said Ruby at last, entering a door at the far end of the hall. Margaret followed her into the drawing room, and sure enough, there was Edward, speaking in a low, soothing voice to a little girl with whom he shared a remarkable resemblance. "My lord," said Ruby with a short incline of her head, "Miss Andrews has arrived." Edward sat upright from where he'd been leaning forward to speak to the little girl and smiled. "Miss Andrews, I'm so happy to have you joining us here. May I introduce my sister, Rebecca?" Margaret was just about to greet Rebecca herself when the little girl got to her feet and offered a short curtsy. Her eyes darted this way and that as she offered a quiet, "Hello." While a moment previous Margaret had been caught up in her own anxieties over being in such regular proximity to Edward, she found her heart now going out to this small girl, at once so polite and so shy. Margaret had been much the same way as a child, intrigued by those around her, yet terrified of new faces. Margaret put as much warmth into her smile as she could muster and approached Rebecca. She lowered herself just slightly, not so much as to be improper, but enough that she could speak to the little girl more on her own level. "It's a great pleasure to meet you, Lady Rebecca," Margaret said. "My name is Miss Andrews. Your brother has told me a great deal of positive things about you, and I must say, I'm quite looking forward to getting to know you myself." Rebecca seemed taken aback by the praise. She bit her lip and glanced up quickly at her brother, who laughed and patted her head fondly. "As I believe I mentioned earlier, Rebecca can be a touch shy," Edward said. "As can I," said Margaret with a laugh, righting herself. She smiled back at Rebecca. "We can all be a little shy at times. That doesn't mean we don't have things worth saying." At this, Rebecca's eyes brightened. "Edward says you read all the same books as he does." "We have read a lot of the same material, that's true. I want to get better at reading. Every time I try and pick up a book on my own, it takes me ages to get all the way through." Rebecca wrinkled her nose and glared playfully up at her brother. "I'd like to discuss the stories with Edward, but he always finishes them before me and moves on before I can." Edward looked faux abashed. His words were addressed to Rebecca, but he was making eye contact with Margaret. "Do forgive me, my dear. I didn't realize my reading habits were giving you such trouble." "That's all right," said Rebecca with a shrug. This time, when she glanced back at Margaret, there was a shrewdness to her look Margaret hadn't expected. "You're going to stay and teach me, so I'll be even faster at reading than Edward. Right, Miss Andrews?" "Yes, my dear," said Edward, still looking at Margaret. "If I have my way, Miss Andrews will be here for a long time yet to come." Margaret had hoped that once she met Rebecca and had the chance to recontextualize Edward here in his home, her nerves might lessen. Of course, when Ruby returned and announced the Duke of Somerset himself was feeling well enough to host them for tea, Margaret's pulse sped up to the point she could hear it pounding in her ears. "I'm only here because Edward believes me suitable for the position," Margaret thought, as Ruby marched both her and Edward towards the Duke's quarters. "If the Duke finds reason to disagree, will I be forced to return to the Royal Lion?" The thought of what she would have to say to Rupert to get her old job back left Margaret reeling with light nausea. Edward must have been able to tell something was off, because as Ruby entered the Duke's quarters to announce their presence, he tapped the back of Margaret's hand. She jerked to attention. "Are you all right?" Edward asked quietly. Margaret could only take a shaky breath and nod. The way Edward was looking at her was at once both kind and driven. It was the sort of look that said, "We will get through this together." Margaret's fears eased. Moments later, she and Edward sat together at a small table that had been placed at His Grace's bedside. While Ruby went to fetch the tea, Edward introduced his father to Margaret, and Margaret to his father. "It's an honour, Your Grace," said Margaret. "Thank you for opening your home to me, and for this opportunity." Said the Duke, glaring as he studied her. Margaret tried not to let the harsh look spike her nerves again. She instead resolved to study him right back. There was a resemblance between him and his sons, but only a slight one. The boys must have favoured their late mother. Yet there was something of Edward in the Duke's face. Margaret couldn't quite put her finger on precisely what it was. "You have a sharp eye about you," said the Duke at last, speaking with more clarity than Margaret had expected from the sickly man. "Forgive me, Your Grace," said Margaret, inclining her head. "Though my purpose here is to educate young Lady Rebecca, I hope to learn new things myself, wherever I am. I expect there is a lot I might learn from a family as respected as yours." The Duke's brows shot up. He cut his eyes over to his son. "Where did you find this one, Edward?" A spike of panic shot through Margaret, but Edward kept his face even. "I assure you, Miss Andrews is more than qualified." The Duke waved him away. He gave Margaret a sly look, almost like they were in on a secret together. "That's not what I mean. This one's got a silver tongue." Margaret was caught unaware by the Duke's apparent goodwill. It seemed Edward was as well. He regarded his father with his mouth slightly agape, like the man had suddenly become a stranger. They continued on with tea, and Margaret shared some of her past, but only snippets. Mostly she tried to keep her parts of the conversation focused on books she'd read, talents she'd developed, and instances in which she felt she'd demonstrated strong character. Edward seemed to be listening intently to this bit as well, which forced Margaret to do what she could to fight off a blush. When the meeting finally concluded, His Grace did begin to tire rather quickly, and Edward escorted Margaret out. He shook his head. The fever must have him in some sort of delirium. "He seemed quite sound of mind to me. If only. I've never seen him act so welcoming to a newcomer on the staff, much less—" Edward seemed to think better of what he was going to say and locked his jaw tight. "What is it?" Margaret prompted. They'd stopped walking, lingering now in the turn of the hall where Margaret would need to turn away if she was to properly unpack before dinner. Edward looked at her, like he was weighing whether to move forward with saying whatever personal information had just cut off their conversation. Margaret, with a boldness that left her half exasperated with herself, reached forward and touched the back of Edward's hand, lightly, ever so lightly, just as he'd done for her before the meeting with the Duke. She was not prepared for Edward to literally shiver at the touch. They both blinked in surprise. Edward, however, quickly shook off the odd reaction. And really perhaps it wasn't a reaction to anything Margaret had done at all, perhaps he was just cold, and said, "Father favours Robert." "I'm sure that's not—" "It is, to an extreme degree. I was expecting, well, in all honesty, Miss Andrews, I was expecting to have to argue with him on your behalf. Not because there's anything lacking in your qualifications." Edward hastened to add off of Margaret's panicked look. "Rather, I'd expected he would take a dislike to you purely because I was the one vying for you to be the governess." Margaret didn't know what to do with this information. Surely Edward had to be mistaken. How could a father with someone as odious as Robert for one son, and someone as kind and patient as Edward for the other, favour the former? "Your father seemed quite kind to me," Margaret said slowly. She met Edward's eyes, fearful of accidentally dismissing his feelings. But first impressions don't always give one the full picture, do they? Something darkened in Edward's gaze. Only then did Margaret become fully aware that they were alone in the hall. Alone, and standing quite close. "I don't believe I fully agree," he said, voice quiet. Almost like now he was the one sharing a secret. "I believed you were exceptional from the first moment I saw you. Time has only proved me more right." Margaret's heart jumped to her throat. Edward blinked, like he too was surprised by the intensity of the words that had just left his mouth, and took a step back. "Thank you," said Margaret, feeling dizzy. "After all the words that you've read, Surely you could have come up with something better than thank you. Edward cleared his throat. The day is getting late. Perhaps I should leave you to get settled. That was the last thing Margaret wanted. She wanted to stay with Edward and have him continue the tour of the manor. They might even spend some time together in the study he'd mentioned in their earliest conversations, to take a look at the Lockwood's vast library. But Margaret was already at high risk of overstepping. "Very well," she said, taking her own step back. "May the remainder of your afternoon be a pleasant one, my lord."
Scan the QR code or click on the link in the description to read the full book. The full audiobook will be available on YouTube in a few days. What did you like the most? Comment below and share this video on your social media and with your friends. Watch one of the following videos. Subscribe to our channel, like this video, and hit the notification bell to not miss any new audiobooks. Thank you for watching.